It's done.
Excellent. We'll just wait for another minute or so. Okay. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir à la troisième session de la série Boîtes et outils en sciences humaines numériques de la session d'hiver. Good morning and welcome to the third session of the winter iteration of the Data DH Toolbox series. I'm Jada Watson, Coordinator of Digital Humanities at the University of Ottawa, and I'm excited to be hosting this series again this semester. Before we begin today, I would like to start our session with an Indigenous land affirmation. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date, l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old. We honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So today we're learning how to excel with spreadsheets. This is probably my favorite title of all the DH Toolbox sessions we've had this year. One thing that's always been important to me as a DH researcher and teacher is eliminating barriers to working with technology, whether it's a financial barrier or just, everyday nerves and discomfort with working with technology. There are so many tools that we use regularly in our research, or I should say in our everyday lives, that can help bridge the gap or ease someone into a new way of working with digital tools in their research. Excel is one of those tools. It's one of the most widely used in actively managing research data, and it has capabilities that can be used to advance a research project. So for me, this has always been a really important tool to bring into the classrooms or when working with students who are interested but a little bit apprehensive about how to take those next steps. So I'm really excited to have my colleague Chantal Ripp here today. She's going to introduce us to I've lost my place. Some basic and intermediate capabilities of Microsoft Excel. We're going to discuss guidelines for organizing and formatting data on worksheets, some key formulas and functions, and how to create simple graphs and pivot tables. She'll also explore throughout the session best practices for data management in Excel, along with tips on file names, README files, and metadata. And so to introduce our fearless leader today, Chantal Ripp is the Interim Research Data Management Librarian at the University of Ottawa, where she, with a specialization in data services for social sciences, management, humanities, and law. She's going to be presenting a pilot project for managing library-required data collections at the Scholars Portal Dataverse. She did, sorry, in the past. At the past 2020 CRK and Access in Transition Conference. And I'm really excited to say that she's going to be one of the leaders of the Research Data Management 2-day workshop that will be part of DH site this May. More information on that to come. I'm going to put slides into the chat momentarily. Sorry, not slides, but notes and handouts. And I'll keep adding them as I see new participants. So don't worry if you see the links more than once. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to type them into the chat or into the Q&A, and I'll ask them on your behalf. I might not ask them right away. Sometimes I wait for an appropriate moment in relation to the content, but I do always get to the questions. So don't worry about that. And so without further ado, I pass the screen over to Chantal.
Thank you, Jada. Thank you for the introduction. So yes, as Jada shared within the introduction, we will be covering a lot of information today. Part one, we'll be talking about the do's and don'ts of formatting your spreadsheet. We'll talk about tips and tricks when strategizing and becoming familiar with your data set. We're going to be putting the fun in functions. So we'll be looking at some very basic functions along with some more advanced functions. We're going to be looking at creating tables and some basic figures and charts. And then hopefully, time permitting, we're going to get into doing some pivot tables and pivot charts analysis as well. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. So Excel, as many are probably familiar with, is a tool used in actively managing your research data. It is primarily used for data entry, storage, analysis, and visualization. It is, as you know, primarily a spreadsheet program, and it contains a number of columns and rows where each intersection of a column or row is considered a cell. We're going to get into an Excel spreadsheet and look at these concepts in a little bit more detail. But first, what I wanted to highlight here on this slide is the University of Ottawa Information Technology offers Microsoft 365 to students and faculty, and you get to work with tools that you're familiar with. So the applications of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. You can actually access these tools on your web browser, and these will feature collaborative features, and you can download the Microsoft application on up to 5 of your own devices. So that is something I definitely took advantage of when it was deployed. I was able to use OneDrive and download Microsoft Office on my older laptops because I had access to it on 5 devices. All the data that we'll be working with today is stored in the cloud in Canada. So if you're not familiar, I provided a link to the website of information technology where you find that. You go to office.com, or which I'm already logged in, and you use your UOttawa access credentials to log in. So for this workshop today, we're going to be using a data that I found in a CSV format, and I retrieved this from a project on a Kaggle website. I was looking for something entertaining, and I found a Rotten Tomatoes movies and critics data set. So in the handout sheet that's been provided to you in the chat, you have a handout. If you get lost today or if we don't run out of time, there's a comprehensive worksheet of what we'll be covering today in there, and it also provides links to the data sets if after this workshop you yourself want to go and have a practice around with the data. I modified the data set that I found on the website to split it up so that we can use it to investigate some of the functions that I would like to show today. So as a first step, I'm going to open up my spreadsheet here as an example. It is vital to organize your worksheet in a certain way that allows you to use certain functions like sort and filter, and in order to be able to analyze your data by generating statistics and visualizations. So each record or observation should be in a row. And here, each record is going to be a specific movie title. And each variable within your data set or category should be a column, so not in a row. And here we have examples, the content rating, genre, release date. These being our variables are organized in a column. So this allows our data set to be structured in a rectangular format and flat, which allows us to be able to do some very interesting things within Excel. So another example here, other than a movie data set, if you're compiling budget expenses, for example, each expense you could consider being a row, or if you're doing survey analysis, for instance, each row would represent a respondent's responses to your survey. Now I would like to show you a screenshot here, or an image here, and I'd like to ask you, and Jada, if you could please launch the poll, how many good practices and bad practices do you see on this spreadsheet? So I'll give you a couple minutes to, and I'll see if I think you can drag and drop and move the poll yourself as well. Take a look. Here we have a table. We also have some other analysis within the table, some spreadsheets. Can you identify what bad practices you see on the spreadsheet? And I think we can close the poll now. And if we display the results, we can see what we've all been able to identify. So great, correct. Some of the bad practices you would like to avoid are certainly you don't want to merge any of your cells because that would break some of the functions you want to do. You don't want to put your graph together with your data. That is considered a bad practice. You want to make sure that you have just one value in each cell. So what I mean by that, sometimes you'll see units of analysis along with your data, and you don't want that within the same cell. You want to avoid using special characters here, like the plus signs. You don't want to have more than one variable in a column. So here you can see under streaming and standard content rating, this would actually not be a good practice at all. You preferably not to leave blanks, and we'll explore this more later when we open up our data set. And again, you don't want to put your analysis and raw data in the same worksheet. You would like to save your raw data and actually do analysis in another worksheet or in another completely different data set. Now on the next poll, Jada, if you can launch that one, although there are some numerous bad practices in here, there are some good ones as well. Can you identify what good practices you see that are happening in this data sheet? We'll just give that a couple of seconds and then we'll launch the results. Perfect. I think we can close it now and see what the consensus was. So as we noted in some of the bad practices, preferably when you're working in a data cell, you don't want to necessarily merge cells. Some of the good practices you'd like to ensure, and we'll go over these in concepts as we work through our data set. You want to ensure that you have only one variable in one column. So an example here or over here. As a bad practice, using your header row for variable names so you can identify what is in your columns. Put the units of the variable so that you understand what you're looking at. Runtime, for instance, would be in minutes. And as a practice down here, naming your worksheets. As you start to develop more tabs, you want to become, as a quick reference to understand what is in those, and preferably not keep sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3 as examples. Now we're actually going to go open the data set for which we're going to work with today. And I have this stored on my OneDrive. So I've navigated to my folder. And as a best practices in data management, it's preferable to preserve the original version of your data. So that way you can actually go back to in its original format. I have these available here in CSV. And this allows me to then say if I made an error or I made a mistake or I want to actually replicate my analysis, I'll always have an original version to come back to. And what you can do here is either copy the data set, and I'm going to do this for mine. I'm going to actually copy my raw data set to a separate folder. I've named my separate folder analysis, but you can name it something that makes sense to you or your workflow. For instance, that could be working or other. I'm going to navigate to my work folder. I have data, and here I'm going to copy my data sets into my analysis folder. And from there, this is where we're going to actually work on our data set today. You can see here by this little 3 blue lines that they have been successfully transferred over. I'm going to open up Rotten Tomato Movies. And just as a quick reference for those who may be less comfortable or less familiar working in Excel, kind of a breakdown of what you'll see here on the top ribbon, home here. Actually, I think I can actually get a quick cool annotation. So home here is common actions that you'll find like formatting, copying, pasting, inserting, and deleting across your columns and rows. The insert one here allows you to find commands that allows you to add objects and charts. We'll be using some of those features. The formula tab is where you'll be able to actually find help to define and control and audit your Excel formulas. The data tab features, commands that enable you to connect to external data and manage the data in your spreadsheet. We have here review that protects data integrity in your spreadsheet, has functions like spell check, protect sheet, protect workbook, and track changes. View allows you to control how you visually interact with your spreadsheet. And I'm going to remove this here. Open in desktop, which we will eventually get to, so you can work within the traditional desktop view, and viewing. So by default, because I'm in an Excel and I've opened a CSV, I can't actually modify any of the data. I have to be able to convert this into a format for which Excel will recognize. If you're in the data desktop application view, that's not an issue, but I will have to do this in the web view. So what that has done is I can see here under save, I am now working with an Excel file. I just wanted to note some of the, I don't know how to get rid of this beautiful green circle, but note some of the features on our home page here as well. We have a lot of formatting tools within the home ribbon that you'll recognize, maybe if you're familiar with Word and other applications. A formula bar here, which we'll explore further details later when we start creating some formulas. Obviously, your grid of cells where your data is stored. Our columns are denoted by A, B, C, D, so by the alphabet, and the rows are denoted by numbers. And similar to the desktop application, on the bottom of the sheet here is where you can add in new worksheets. We are in the in worksheet, and we will rename that later. And on the bottom right over here, you have some zoom capabilities. On the Files tab of your worksheet, these are some of the features you'll typically recognize in the desktop application. But one of the things I did want to highlight is you can actually share in Microsoft 365 your data set. So I can invite Jada, for instance, and send her an email, and we could collaborate on this worksheet together online or at her own leisure, similar to what you'd be seeing in Google Sheets. Save as, these are some of the other functions you may be familiar with. And under info, another thing I wanted to highlight, here's a quick link to actually open your Excel worksheet in the desktop application, but as well as version history. So a quick note on version history. Version control is a good way to track revisions of a data set or process. So if your research involves more than one person collaborating on it, this would be very essential to understand what person has come in and done different changes to the data set file. Or even myself, I've gone through sometimes and I've deleted rows accidentally, and I can actually go and review previous versions and restore them. Now, if you're working in a desktop version of Excel and you're not using cloud-based solutions, you can do this manually by saving your spreadsheet after numerous changes and adding version control into your file name. So adding, for instance, the file name, and at the end of that, version 1, version 2, version 1.4. One important thing I do want to note, though, is that if you are working in the cloud solution, OneDrive, and you do intend to then export your data set and share it, your version history will not be exported with it. So let's go ahead and open our data in our data set, or in our desktop application. One of the certain features I like working with in Excel is having some keyboard shortcuts. Control-C would copy a cell, and Control-V would paste it. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with some of those. But when you're working with Excel, there are some great keyboard shortcuts that are worth knowing. Control-Shift-Down arrow will highlight all the rows until it comes to a logical break in your data set. Similarly, if you do Control-Shift-Right arrow, it will highlight that row until it comes to a blank cell. And if you do Control-A, it will highlight your whole table. So this could be very useful when you're working within certain functions. And we'll be using some of these keyboard shortcuts throughout the presentation. Another great practice is in when you come to view. As you scroll, and as you probably saw when I went to Control Down, we have a lot of data sets, 10,000 rows, over 10,000 rows. But by the time I get down here, I can't readily tell what my column headers are. That wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but if I started having a lot of columns and I'm working across them, a good practice could be to freeze pan your top view. So this is going to freeze the first row so that it's visible throughout my worksheet. Now, as I start scrolling through my data set, that primary column of my header stays constant, and I can make sure if I'm doing data entry, for instance, I know I'm working in the appropriate column. Some other features that are great to have are wrap text on our home bar here. You have the feature wrap text, which you're probably familiar with, or another quick function is once you highlight between two cells, you get this kind of line with two arrows on it. And when you double click that, it will wrap the text within your column to the longest character string in there. Another thing that I like to work with, and maybe not many are familiar with this, is working with Excel formatted tables. And so you're going to find that feature under the tab Insert. And under Insert on the top left under Tables, there is this feature called Tables. And we're going to click on that, and it's going to highlight by default our range of data. And I do have headers within my data set. So yes, please, I'm going to check this. And what you can see off the bat is an formatted Excel table. And this allows us to more readily organize and analyze our data within this table. It has features already built in like sorting and filtering. And it allows you to view your data in different formats, which we'll see a little bit later. Other benefits of Excel table include formulas and formatting, which fill down automatically. So whereas before, if I were entering a formula, I'd have to repeat it or drag and drop it. When you're working in a table view, formulas are automatically applied throughout the column. And formulas are structured using reference to table cells, and they use column names. So you may not be familiar with that. So when we get down to the section where we're starting to use functions and formulas within Excel, I'll make sure to pull that out because it's a little bit different than when you're typically used to seeing it if you're working with data cell ranges. Anytime you create a new data table, it's important to, and this is a good spot to where I've highlighted, rename your table name. As a practice, you don't necessarily want to keep table 1, table 2, table 3. And this is actually another great practice whenever you're going to be importing functions, you can actually call your table based on your table name. So here I'm going to call it movie title. And we'll call that our table for now. Perfect. So now we're going to just become familiar with this data set and explore a little bit by using some of the features like filters. A filter function permits you to filter data in a column and allows the user to only display certain values. So if your data is not already identified in a table format where these then become automatically turned on, you'll find the filter function under the tab Data. Oh, pardon me. Under the Data tab, well, it's already been turned on. Under my Home tab here, as it's already been turned on. So as an example of how this feature would work, I'm going to select under Content Rating Description. I'm interested in exploring within my data set, first of all, what comes up and how my data would then be customized if I were to select only certain one of these. I actually think I forgot to mention the data set that we're working with is Rotten Tomatoes. So here we have the movie titles, and across the movie titles, we have the content rating description. So how have these movies been rated across motion pictures rating system, various genres, the original release date of the data set, the streaming release date of the data set, the runtime, which is the length of the movie that was played in minutes, and the production company that released it. The reason why I chose this data set, I thought it'd be a fun exercise to look at what movie should I watch this weekend? And because I do have young kids, one of the things I will be limiting my search to is maybe general audience and parental guidance suggestion, which is generally the classification of G and PG. You will be able to tell that a dataset filter has been applied when you see this little arrow icon next to your filter, and also you'll see the colors of my rows have changed and the numbers have stayed consistent. So you'll see here it jumps from 1 to 45 to 67 to 72. It is displaying only the visual cells that match my filter description. And I can remove the filter. Either I can reselect everything or just click here, clear filter, and I'll get my original table back. Another fun thing to help you explore your data is conditional formatting. Conditional formatting allows you to quickly and effectively change the formatting of your data table. So that can be, for instance, cell colors, we can change the font colors, etc. for certain cells based on certain parameters. So let's go and explore these. Under your Home tab here, you have the icon Conditional Formatting. And you have various options. There is the highlight cell rule, which gives you certain parameters, top to bottom rule, a data bar rule allows you to define gradient, color scales, and this type of conditional formatting wouldn't necessarily work with the type of data that we're looking at today. But one example that I'm interested in exploring is using conditional formatting with the parameters text that contain. If I click on my genre table here, I can see that there are various genres, categories, and these are separated by commas. So I can see within this column, the movie Feels Good Man is identified as a documentary, whereas the movie Akira is an action adventure, animation, drama, mystery, and suspense, science fiction, and fantasy. Well, I'm interested in maybe using conditional formatting to identify cells that would have the term or the genre identified as action and adventure. I can click on conditional formatting, text that contains, and here by default it's going to find the first word, but I'm interested in action. I can also extend that to include action and adventure, but I want to see which cells come up with that. The first selected option is light red filled with dark red, but you have some other options here, and maybe green fill with dark green text. And that visually changes my data. And it allows me to quickly see at a glance while I scroll down what satisfies that condition. Now, an interesting feature, if we talk again about filters, is that I can actually filter not only on the predefined values, but also on other elements if I've applied a filter by color, for instance. I could exclude any of the rows or any of the cells that would have no fill, or I can filter by those that have specifically the color code that matches. If I select that color, now within my table, again, I can see a filter has been applied. And these are all the titles that correspond with having a genre classified as action or adventure. I think it was action I put in my title. So this is one feature that can be done. One thing I want to note here is that I'm using conditional formatting to help me explore my data, but I don't want to use this as necessarily to identify a specific condition. So what I mean by that, other analysis programs can much more readily handle data that's stored in a column than detected and encoded in a cell. So if this was a particular value for me, I would want to actually maybe create another column and say, with a code or a descriptor that it actually has the value, has action and adventure. Because if I were to re-export this data outside of an Excel back into a CSV, we're going to lose the table formatting and the color. So if I'm using conditional formatting to find important information, I'd want to make sure to recapture that in another cell. Right now I'm using this to find to play with our data and explore some of the interesting features. Now, one thing I wanted to highlight is I'm going to do a sort, and a sort is another function where you can sort from, it will sort your data either from A to Z, or if it was a time series, longest to shortest, newest to oldest. But when there is a break in your data, by what I mean by break, pardon me, didn't mean to apply that. A blank in your cell, typically, not by typically, it will actually affect your sorting feature. So if I go like this, or it should have, typically a sort will stop at a blank and it won't necessarily translate to the rest of your data set. Or if I go back through the other way, it seems to have worked. But in a raw data set, you may not be able to sort effectively if you have blanks within your data set. There is another conditional formatting feature that could be very interesting to explore. And you can actually, we'll highlight our whole table, and we're going to use conditional formatting. And we're going to go to highlight cell rule. But in here, none of these are going to be able to meet our specific requirements. We're going to click on more rules. Here we have the option, format only cells that contain. And here, if you do the drop down, you'll see that there are some specific options here that would meet of interest. We have blanks. And by default, those are then returning those results, but I can actually format those as well, and actually maybe even apply a color filter. I'm going to do that with an orange. And press OK. So this may be a good exercise as a data validation step. If you're having research assistants or others doing data entry, and you want to make sure to quickly scan your data set to make sure no one put in a blank or miss putting in a value that should have been there. This is a great way to quickly visualize within your data set where those blanks could be. And similarly, you can filter and look at those blanks. So if we filter by color, I could find by those blanks again. And a best practice in data management, because when you want to go and use pivot tables to do your analysis, pivot tables actually recognize blanks and will include them in your analysis, and sometimes we'll find them to the counts. So what you'd want to do is avoid blanks if possible, and use a common denoter, be that NA, not applicable. Some applications, when I used to work at Statistics Canada, use the numbers -999 to identify a blank. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, especially if you're in a column that has numeric values like runtime. So for this instance, I am going to use an A. And as a quick fill, I'm going to bring it down. And I want to be consistent throughout my data. And I can see when I look quickly across, the only other cell that had blanks tends to have been in the streaming release date. Another option is when you're filtering across your columns, if I deselect all, they do come up as one of the options as a blank. And I can click blank. If I go to the top of my data set and apply that across. Now I shouldn't have any blank cells. Pardon me. Meant to say clear streaming. Oh, pardon me. Clicking too many things. Here we go. So now that we've had a chance to kind of play and explore some of our data sets, you can apply under back at home. I'm going to remove the conditional formatting so we come back to our original table. Clear rule, you can clear the selected cells. So if I were to just highlight cell D again, it'd remove the highlighting, or I can clear the rule from the entire sheet or the table. I'm going to remove my conditional formatting from the whole table. And now one thing that I like us to start exploring is putting the fun functions. So one of the most common uses of Excel is to perform some calculations, and there are many different kinds of possible calculations. Anything from combining values stored in a cell to be able to easily do addition, subtracting, multiplying across cells, to doing or to even performing analysis on a cell or a group of cells. So we can use very complex functions, and those start to get very interesting, as we'll see, and use formulas like if or choose. So in Excel, a formula is an expression that operates on a value in a range of cells, and typically it's denoted, and I'm going to go up to the very top of my cell again, with an equal sign. Excel would recognize with the equal sign that you are looking to input a formula. And the functions are predefined formulas in Excel. So one function that is a very fun one to work with is a very basic one, is a date function. So I've seen here through the original release dates, they have the information organized by the year, then the month, and then the day. But maybe for this table that's a little bit rich for my taste, I'm particularly looking for just the year information. I can input the function equals year, bracket. You would open the bracket, and Excel is great because it works through to tell you what it's looking for. It's looking for a serial number. What I'm interested in exploring or extracting is the date reference for this cell. And as I mentioned earlier, in Excel table, formulas are structured references to table cells. So it's showing you the column name, and here that is at original release date, as opposed to seeing typically, as you would say, E2, for instance. By pressing enter, it applied to the cell, so 2020, double clicking, that formula has been applied to each of the subsequent cells. Another interesting one that we will be working with, and I'm going to rename this column as an example to year, so we understand what we are seeing. I'll stay consistent with the naming convention across here, is using a function like if. So the if function is often used when you want to sort your data according to a given logic. And the best part of the if function is that you can embed formulas and functions into it. And we'll look at another example with if numbers. So in this column, for instance, I'm going to denote with the equal sign if. And to help with my movie selection this weekend, truthfully, I can't stay up anything or stand to watch anything longer than potentially 2 hours, because otherwise I'll fall asleep. So similarly, it's telling me within my formula, if the next item it's looking for to be able to support this formula is the logical test. So I am looking into if 94 minutes is greater than 120 minutes. If that statement were true, I'd like for it to return the term long. If that statement were false, what's another short? So I can see here the if function allowed me to identify that 94 minutes, pardon me, is actually a decent enough length for myself. It's short. And if I were to double click again, that's applied. And the first logic here, long, I can see that 129 minutes, my function or my formula successfully interpreted this. 129 is longer or greater than 120, so long was returned. I'm going to rename my column movie length, for instance. Now, one thing I've done in the past, and it frustrates me to no end, is if I start clicking through my cell and I start changing the formula that's been there. And that can happen if you're looking to be working across multiple data cells or if you're going to be doing different things. A common practice that I would recommend is to change your data into a static value. But before doing that, it's also a very important step, and something that we've often overlooked is documenting the steps that we are taking. And why would we want to do that? Well, you want to be able to come back and identify what have you been doing in your data. If you are collaborating within a data set, your co-collaborator would want to be able to come in and see what steps have you done in the analysis. And if you are turning certain values within some of your formulas to static values, you want to be able to go back and refer to the formula that you used. This doesn't have to be anything particularly onerous or detailed, but you'll be very happy if you did document these steps in the future. So you want to capture things like what calculations did you decide to do, how did you do them, maybe even capture some of the reasons for these changes. And I would document this in a separate document, either in a Word document or for in this purposes, we're going to rename this cell here and add another item. And I'm going to rename this change log for my documentation purposes. And what I'm looking to do is just itemize what I've been doing so far. And I'm going to try and do this consistently throughout our exercise today so that we can see the steps that we've been taking. And these could be very valuable for us in terms of reproducibility. If we're going to document at the end of the day a README file, or for, we've deleted our data set or certain values, and we want to go back and reproduce them, we'll have steps that kind of articulated what we did. If I'm collaborating on a data set, maybe want to identify who did the function or who did the changes, what formulas I did, maybe some other notes, and I said formulas. And so for instance, so far, we took the raw data set in CSV and we created a formatted Excel table. I did that, no formulas were applied there. We did use conditional formatting. Find the blanks and replace them with NA. What else did we do? We created a new column and named the variable year, for instance. I did that, and I did use a particular formula. The formula I used, I'm going to put a space so that Excel doesn't think I'm actually entering a formula. A space will allow me to think it's a character string. I believe what we were looking at was if a runtime, the column was runtime, was greater than 120, we were then denoting that was long, and the next one was short. cetera, et cetera. You can itemize these for easier reference and continue with that. So now I will strive to continue to practice this throughout our presentation as well. So again, if I were to be clicking around in here, I don't necessarily want to change the formula, and there is no reason for me to keep this formula particularly live. If we were looking at coming back and changing that, that's okay. You don't necessarily need to do that. But since this is now, I'm content with this, I don't plan to change the formula. I'm going to copy it and paste on top of my cells. You'll see here you have some various options. The normal paste, and it will paste the values and formulas as is. So that's not exactly what I'm looking for. This paste will allow me to paste the values. So it will paste the formula of the copied cell and adjust the range to where it is based. So this will give me my specific values as is. And you can see now if I'm highlighting across, these are now values. Similarly for this row, I still have the formulas live, and I'm content now that I've done my modification. I'm going to copy this and paste my values. And I will stop here in a minute to give Jade an opportunity to address a question, I believe.
Yes, you could read my mind.
Please, what question do we have so far?
Okay, so what is the benefit to adding numbers for an item list? How does that make it easier to look through?
In the changelog?
I believe so, yes.
So for myself, I'm trying to itemize what I was going through in terms of the major steps. For instance, I could potentially use this if I were doing some version control. This might help me identify what I did in those. But for me, it's more documenting the itemized steps. You wouldn't necessarily need that. I've seen more rough versions of documenting notes just with the steps taken. This is more to document your workflow of what you've gone through. And there, I do have links in a document that was provided in a handout, how to create a more structured README file. I'm using this here to help me support doing a more formalized documentation after.
Thank you. That's the only question.
Okay, there will be time for other ones. Again, this is a lot of information, but in the handouts that we provided, it goes into these very detailed ones with screenshots as well. I think I documented about 14 pages for us to be able to reproduce what we're doing here today. So far, we've created a new column, year, and movie. Now, when I got a hold of this data set and I started to explore, we did use conditional formatting on jar, but what I realized is, again, one of the practices we saw earlier is that you want one value per cell. And if we think of each jar category as a value, so if action adventure is one value, animation is a value, comedy is a value, kids and family is a value, they're really concatenated in the same cell, and it makes it difficult for me to analyze or even sort through some of these data sets. Later on, I'm going to want to be able to maybe do some filters, some pivot table analysis, and this kind of limits this functionality. So one thing I did explore even on myself, and I document this in another Excel sheet that I can show, was, well, what if I use the Excel wizard, split text into different columns? We'll explore that, but we'll also see it is not what I needed it to do. So by highlighting jars, I did go into data, and there is a beautiful wizard here in Excel that comes predefined, where it allows you to split a single column of text into multiple columns. So this can be very useful if you have, let's just say, a person category within your data set, and it's last name, comma, first name, and you wanted to restructure that by last name, for instance. You can use this text to column, and it will break out this cell based on certain delimitators. So let's click on that and see what I mean. In my cell range here, it is delimited by commas and tabs. So clicking through here, this is how my data set is split up right away within one column. Clicking next, you could see drama and mystery is separated by a comma. Or if I did have spaces, for instance, but I'm not going to be selecting spaces, because that would then break up mystery and suspense into two separate entries, and I want those to be kept together. As you can see here, drama, mystery, and suspense are then together. And for others, that will actually start breaking it up across multiple cells. So let's click next, and you can specify which cell you want that in. I do not want it in D1. I'm going to create a new cell over here. and press finish. So now I have new columns that were created, jar 1, or jar 2, jar 3, jar 4. These are based off the original jar column, and it did break up my data successfully as I had intended, but it still isn't exactly what I wanted. So what this prohibits me from doing in this way that it broke it up is I would actually have to tally, if I wanted to know, how often is action adventure genre assigned to a movie title, I'd have to total them across all these subcategories. Because when I looked at my genre section, they were organized alphabetically. So I don't know this movie, Once Upon a Deadpool. Is it more of an action adventure? Is it more comedy? So it's not very hierarchical. So this is not exactly what I'm looking to do here. This isn't going to support my analysis. So I'm going to delete these. One practice of having one value per cell is then taking these various categories and then breaking them up across the columns and then going across and say, is action adventure represented as a jar? No. And I can denote that with a code like 0. Well, there are functions that can support us doing that. And you can actually, as we talked about earlier, if's a very strong and useful function, and you can concatenate that with other functions. Is number here is going to be the one that we're going to be using. So I have another data set that I'm going to go and open, because we'll be using these for other purposes. And I'm going to go ahead and add these into my data set right now. Open in desktop. And while I'm at it, we will be doing a match function, and I'm going to bring in the data set now for that, and we'll come back to that later. Now I can close this other data set, because now the data that I want to work with is in one Excel sheet. What do I mean by that? I'm going to use another paste option, transpose, which took my data that was organized down one column and transposed it across the top columns. And I'm going to use a function, if, with a bracket, is number. Pardon me. And you can see that they start to pop up, so I recognize the function. So is number will look at the data in jar and return true for numbers and false for anything else. But I'm not looking at numbers, I'm looking at text. So we're going to compare this with another function, search. There are two functions that allow you to search through text in a column, search, which is not to be exact, and find, which has to look for the exact match. But we'll be looking for search. For instance, I'm looking in this column for the genre action and adventure. Action and adventure. In the genre tab, so over here. And I'm going to denote, oh, pardon me, I have a wrong column there. Close this one and close is number. If the statement is true, I want it to return a 1. If the statement is 0, I want it to return a 0. Oh, pardon me if I can actually type. And pressing enter, and fingers crossed I haven't mistyped. I typed something wrong. I think I have an extra one here. Here, I'm just going to keep it consistent with D2. So I'm referencing the column D, variable 2. And now I have an extra one as well. IF is number search. Oh, pardon me, I missed my bracket here. And it's highlighting it, so I can see that the search function is looking to find the text documentary within this column. Now this should work. We've entered too many arguments for this function. Double checking because it worked last night. Isn't that always the case? That closed that one, that closed that one. This one? No. Well, isn't this fun? Well, what I do have open, and as a good practice, my data set, which I did this whole exercise the other day. And I'm going to go open it and see in my changelog what formula worked. And I have it here, so it should be able to be replicated today. There we go. I'm not exactly sure what I was typing in incorrectly, but I did return a 0. Now, if I were to apply this across, I do see that the logic is being applied across. Here's a 1, and I do see an action adventure. So this would allow me to separate and to have specific unique values by genre, as opposed to just having one category here. I'll repeat the formula one more time and to look for animation as an example. And again, here's an example where if you keep your formulas live and you click around, you're going to click into them. I'll repeat the formula one more time for animation. And then I'm just going to delete the other cells. And in the exercise, I encourage you to go to try this one as well. So again, it's looking for an if statement, which is looking for a logical sequence. Search is looking into genre, looking for the word at this point animation. That is my new column header. Looking in D15, that is not where I want it to look. I want it to look at D2. And that's going to return, if animation is there, a number value. Is number will recognize if it's a number value, and the if statement, if it's true, I want it to say 1. If it's false, I want it to say 0. So it is 0. There is no animation text in documentary. And if I apply it across, I do see it here, which is working. Now, if I were to go to the bottom of my cell, here we go. I can actually now quickly calculate by using the function equals sum. Across all, see if that works. No, because I didn't want here. In pivot Excel tables, there is sometimes a built-in function total row, and here I want to count, and it's counting the zeros, which is not what I want. I don't want it to count the zeros. So there is a function count if the range in you an adventure spell. I cannot spell here because I cannot spell. Okay. This was so much faster when I was using my quick function, and this is why we have those shortcuts. For working in my table feature, I was not capturing the actual cell range that I wanted. So I'm going to skip through this part today and go down here for that. The joys of working sometimes with Excel. Well, while it's there, I do see a Q&A if you wanted to ask that, Jada. If there was another question, that is.
It's just Connie saying, here's to shortcuts.
Yes, here's to shortcuts. I agree. Whenever I was doing my control, well, now I'm going to read, almost getting frustrated to the point I want to replicate it, but I was grabbing my title. And it just highlights the whole thing again.
And a follow-up with amen.
Amen, indeed. Are you going to give me my sum? It's not giving me my sum. Okay, well, we're going to look at that in pivot tables then, because that will be able to calculate my analysis quite quickly. Typically, I would replicate this, and in another data set I have open, which I have shared, I've replicated that same formula across so that I had unique values for each of my genres, or counts for those as well. But for today's exercise, I'm going to be satisfied with that. So we can continue documenting the steps that we took here, and we did use the next function. So, you know, here we could say created a new column header to correspond to the movie genre and created action and adventure. That's what it was. And type in the formula we did, the if statement with is number and search. Now, another one that's very interesting and a fun function that a lot of people use is VLOOKUP. So have you ever wanted to take two tables that you have and join it into one? For instance, here I have another data set that was provided content ratings, not content ratings, pardon me. I did not add that data set yet. I have a data set for ratings, which is very exciting. So beyond having the data set for movie titles, in here I have from Rotten Tomatoes, they're very infamous or notorious Rotten Tomato rating status. The tomatometer, I'm saying that so wrong, tomatometer. Also, I have in here the tomatometer count, rating, audience rating. And so I would like to pair this with my movie titles to be able to do a bit more analysis and find a movie to watch. I'm going to open it, and Excel is opening my CSV file, yes. Did Excel open my CSV file? Open. It hasn't had enough coffee today, my computer. I feel you. Open. Open. Use cloud-based solutions. Copy. Here, okay. Didn't have enough coffee. That's what's been happening with my computer today. Here is my data set ratings. Control A, Control C, back to my movie data set, Control V. Okay, it brought it in appropriately. I'm going to rename this rating so I know what I'm looking at. Perfect. And so what I'm interested in doing is appending some of the fields or data from this data set into my movies tab data set here. So we brought that in and we renamed data set. So what I'm also looking at doing here, I'm going to change my ratings into a table as well. Not table range, pardon me, create table, yes. Do not know what's opening so fast. Discard, I am not in the table query function. What I'm looking to do is just rename my table to rating. Okay. When working in any application, it is important to demonstrate patience as they are working in the background, something I often do not have. Okay, so we assign a name to our data set ratings by inputting in the table feature. And now we're going to learn about the VLOOKUP function. VLOOKUP essentially defines in the formula array what you want to look up, where you want to look for it, the column number in the range containing the value that you would like to return, and whether that needs to be an approximate match or a true match. We can continue with the formula, but if you're not comfortable or don't know all the formulas, I mean, Googling them is very practical, but there is also this formula function. which allows you to give you predefined range. So select a function, and just so happens we are interested in VLOOKUP. And a great tool, if you're not familiar with what that contains, you can click on the help function. This will actually open up in Microsoft Office some great tips on how to leverage and use that, oftentimes with videos. Going back into my data set, we're going to click on VLOOKUP. And again, what we're looking in to do this tool is what value are we looking at? And for VLOOKUP to function appropriately, it needs to look at a data set that has, I'm going to call it a unique value or consistent value between the two data sets. And if I go before applying this function, between my two data sets, I can see that the Rotten Tomato link here, this value, is a link to the movie title in the database. And if I go into my ratings data set, I seem to have the same type of values here. And since it seems to be based on the title of the movie, I can hopefully confidently say they would be unique. And so this is a common field between our two tables. You can think of other things that might have common fields, a survey key, for instance, or if you're looking at music stations, maybe the music stations between two data sets could be a common field. Here we're going to be looking at the Rotten Tomatoes link. So putting in the data that I want to bring in from my ratings, I'm going to bring in the tomato status. I'm going to click in here, function, VLOOKUP, lookup value, my common field is going to be afterward. Lookup table array. So this is my new table rating, which we've renamed ratings. And you can see here that it's populating that range. The column index, from what we said about VLOOKUP, is the column number in the range containing the values you want to return. And that's the column. So if I quickly click over here, I can see the I'm going to say this wrong again, tomato meter status is in column 2. So I'm going to write 2 here. It's the column value I want to return. And again, true is if it's an approximate match, or false if it's an exact match, and I want it to return the exact value. So I'm going to write false and click OK. And this became fresh. So if I go into my rating in the movie afterward, I'm not sure if that's the first title or this unique ID, the value at any rate was fresh. And I can apply this down and bring in, I'm just going to copy the. So now I was able to import data from another table into this table using the VLOOKUP function. I'm going to repeat that 2 times because I'm also interested when we start to look at our analysis using the rating status from Tomatoes as well as the audience rating. I'm more interested in what the audience has to say than critics. I trust my fellow viewers. So now we did that by using the import function or the function tool. I'm just going to type it in this time. So again, I'm looking at VLOOKUP. Parentheses, and here I'll spell out the formula again. What I'm looking up is the common field, followed by a comma. The table array, so that's the range of values in your table that you're looking to pull data in from. And I'm just using a shortcut here. Because I've named my table, I can just call it. The column index, and I don't remember that one off the top of my head, was column 3, and then column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, column 3 and column 6. Here we go. So something I do want to make an important note of. When you use VLOOKUP to return a value from a data table, the function does not differentiate between blanks and 0 values in what it returns. So if the source value is 0, VLOOKUP will return 0. But if the source in my table, if, for instance, I have blanks, which I do, VLOOKUP will return a 0. So it does not differentiate. So a good practice, again, is to look across your data set to make sure that there are no blanks and you understand when using functions what is brought in. I'm going to just look by filtering across. And now what is a challenge for me, and I'm just making an assumption, I'm going to assume there are zeros. So now I don't know what came in as a blank or not applicable. Since the formula is still live, I'm going to, in this field, just find the blanks. Apply the NA as an example here, down. And hopefully Excel doesn't get too angry with me. And because my VLOOKUP function is still live, that data should be reflected. That should be reflected, please, in my table. And now I do see I have NAs. Now I can differentiate what was a true audience 0 versus an imported 0 from VLOOKUP, and that could have changed the value. So it's important to make sure you're familiar with the data that you're using. I will repeat that very quickly because I think in tomato readings, we also have some blanks. So I will find that, consistently name my blank fields not available, and come back. There we go. Now something I'm going to also show, there are advantages to using VLOOKUP, but there's also the match and index function and certain limitations with VLOOKUP. And I didn't speak to this too much at that, but it looks for values always from the left to right. So in this case, it was working out fine because my common field was both at the leftmost column in each of my cells or in each of my tables. But let's just say your table was structured a little bit differently, that could be a problem. One advantage of using the index and match functions together, it can look to the left and it will return values to the left of the lookup value, or it will also look to another range as well. Another benefit would be to specify in your index and match, you can specify a single column that you want to look up in rather than a table array like you had to do in VLOOKUP. But index and match work a little bit differently than VLOOKUP. So while VLOOKUP will automatically return a cell's value, match returns a column row number, and this is why we're pairing it with index that will return the actual value of a cell's value. One thing I'm interested here is it's great that we have these unrated restricted, but I'm not exactly sure, and it's not easy for analysis looking at parental guidance suggestions. I'm going to use the match and index function to create a new field. I'm actually going to import that into here and call it content rating category. And I'm going to assign categories based on the content rating description. We previously brought in that category content there. So we're going to go and use a match function to populate this field. So what I'm looking at doing is bringing in the index function. And again, index is going to return within the parentheses the value of a specific field that's been matched. I am looking at bringing in, yes, comma, an array. And the array for what I'm looking for it to return in my content rating is the values either G through R. No. Okay. Now I'm applying a match function. And I want it to look in my original table. The content rating description. If it matches one of the terms in my content rating here. So I'm looking to see if the term in this cell matches one of these terms. And if I want that to be less than, exact match, or greater, I want an exact match. And I'm going to close my second parentheses. And I'm looking across to make sure I'm not clicking on anything and typing anything weird, and it seems to have matched. So what it did, the match function was looking to see if unrated matched any terms in my content rating, which it has on here, unrated, and the index function returned the value associated to what it matched with, NR. Now, if I go apply it across, you'll see something happens very funny. It works here, but it doesn't work here. But what I'm seeing also is that the B3, B8, these values are moving, and I don't want that to happen. So when you're working in Excel, there is something that you can do to keep these constant, and they're called absolute cell ranges, by applying dollar signs. Now you'll see how that's applied, and I'll do the same here because I don't want this changing. These references will no longer change in my formula. They will become relative, and if I go across, now I can scroll down. I can see they've remained constant, and I was able to bring in all this information. Excellent. Well, I'm also being very mindful of time. A good practice would be to create a data dictionary and define what is these values across all your columns here. I have an example of a screenshot in the handout as well as in my other data set, just as a quick reference to see what that would look like. And did I click on the right one? Pardon me. What a data dictionary does is explains what the variable names and values are in your spreadsheet. So how they are presented in the table, what's a longer explanation, what's measurements of units, and this will very much help in the reproducibility. Using short form variable names is one that doesn't allow you as a user or an end user or partner to really understand what is in there. So I created a data dictionary, for instance, defining what these variable names were, what's the long form, what variable types are they, was it a character, was it a string, was it numeric, and some additional. It takes just a couple of minutes to put that together, depending on how large your data set is, and it can be very valuable for reproducibility. Coming back to our data sets and coming into tables and charts, I'm going to come through quite quickly and just show you as a quick, lovely example. I'm looking for a movie that will satisfy looking with my family. I have 2 kids, 2 and 5, so that's why I'm denoting those. I'm also interested in finding a more current movie, so let's remove the selection all, bring these down, last couple of years. Great, let's limit these selections. And as you can see, my data set is being shortened to correspond to those. And I'm interested to confirm, I'm interested if yes, it is an action, and yes, if it is a cartoon. Let's be real. Now I can actually sort, and I'm going to sort by largest to smallest. And now I have a recommendation of a movie to watch, Onwards, which is PG, relatively new, it's certified fresh, and has a high rating. I'm going to actually copy and paste 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, Control C, and I could tell I'm copying only visible cells here. I'm going to add in a new one, rename table. As we talked about in the beginning, it's best to take away from your raw data and put your analysis somewhere else. I did not copy by accident, pardon me, just the content headings, and I will just bring those in. There we go. And now I've created a simple table. I can repurpose this by hiding values and printing them, but what I want to do from here quickly is bring in a chart. And let's just say I wanted to see, based on the movie titles, how the tomato meter rating and the audience rating compared. And now I'm going to be able to highlight those. I clicked Control and highlighted the cells of interest, click Insert, go to Recommended Chart, and they're recommending a bar chart. I will put that in. By default, it comes into the same sheet. You can leave it in, but as a best practice, I would recommend moving this to a new chart and calling this movie table. Now here, it's a little bit easier to not only view your table, but then to modify the metadata information. So let's give it an appropriate title, tomatometer rating and audience rating for top. How many do we have? 10. And adventure and animation work and animation movies rated. I believe these were all rated PG, just as an example. Now I can compare of the top 10 in a more visually displayed format, movies that I could probably pre-identify to watch this evening. We did not have enough time to get into all of these. I'm gonna quickly just show a very fun feature. I expect this is gonna be very fast, but one of the great advantages of Excel as well is having built-in analysis features. A recommended pivot is a good item to know. It will look at your data set and recommend tables that advise or aggregate your data in a certain way. Or you can come into, pardon me, insert a pivot table. I'm going to create a new worksheet, bring in my movies, and here's actually where you can play with pivot tables given the time and kind of look at how it does about aggregating and creating tabulations of your data. So just as a quick reference, I'm interested in knowing by production company, and there are a lot, what the average tomato rating is, what are their values. Right now I have a count. I'm going to modify that to come back as an average. I can even apply a filter because I'm not interested in movies that are rated R. Let's define that as, pardon me, the filter up here for just PG, why not? And that's one thing I like about pivot tables is that your tables are dynamic and they are very customizable. I can even apply filters within tables. And let's just say I'm going to only return results for movie production companies that have an average tomatometer rating greater than 85%. And my tables have been dynamically done or adjusted. And pivot tables are also, pardon me, dynamic. I can double click on one and I would like to see the movie titles from Artificial Eye Production Company, as it seems to have a high rating for movies. And here are the titles that have been returned. You can create pivot charts quite quickly. Also, while in here, you can have the regular charts, but pivot charts. Similar to pivot tables, pivot charts are dynamic. Given that my table is quite large, I won't insert one now, but there are detailed steps within the handout on how to create a more appropriate pivot table for a table or for this type of pivot table. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I talked a lot. I'm going to come back on video. And I do want to thank everyone for your patience with me today. Clicking around Excel live is always a fun experience. But if you have any questions about the handouts or the contents today, feel free to send me an email. And I hope that you find those handouts useful.
Thank you so much. That was such a great first major dive into Excel. We could always do a part 2 that just sort of picks up from here and goes more advanced. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. There are no questions. Thank you very much. And I'm going to be posting links to the handouts on the DH Toolbox page. So if you weren't able to get them today, oh, Andrea Lemia says we'd love a part 2.
Yes. A lot to cover in an hour. I could talk for another 2 hours probably.
If you weren't able to download the handouts from today, they'll be accessible on the DH site website under DH Toolbox by the end of the week. And just a reminder that we're back here 2 weeks on March 10th for Introduction to API Access with Excel and Google Sheets with Yu Young Lee. It'll be a workshop on learning the basics, basic introduction to API access to various library collections. And with that, I wish everyone a wonderful, wonderful rest of their week. Bye.